See that okay?
Yes.
So thank you for introducing me, Margie. And actually, I recognize a lot of friendly faces as you were introducing yourselves, because I've been around in the Northeast Ohio area for I say over 30 years, because if I say the real amount, I feel like I would sound irrelevant and not. But I did, before I became with Adult Protective Services, I worked in the field of aging, and I worked at Benjamin Rose. I saw some staff like Courtney and some others. I also spent about 10 years with the Passport program. I was the very first waiver social worker that was hired as a case manager assessor for the area agency in Cleveland, Ohio. So I came to Adult Protective Services from a pretty strong community-based setting. I use those resources today as I'm speaking to you from the Attorney General's office. Now my job has changed somewhat, that I'm coming to you not as a direct person investigator, but as a advocate and legislative person. So I have to have my commercial. I work for the Attorney General, Dave Yost. He supports my office, as well as BCI, which many of you are familiar with, provides resources to law enforcement, and OPATA, which provides trainings to law enforcement. So a lot of what I do now is not only educate people like yourself. I also spend a lot of time working with and teaching law enforcement how to identify and address elder abuse. They use a different terminology. They use elder crimes. So one of the things I do a lot is bring those different types of how we view things together to try to get us all on the same page. I was asked in about 30 minutes to kind of review what, how do we address elder financial exploitation in Ohio. I'm going to be addressing this at a very high level. Those of you who know me know that, first of all, I love to talk, so telling me to speak for a short time is challenging. But this particular topic is very complex and complicated. There's no one size fits all. So the reality is we spend a lot of time, I've been spending most of my career looking at these issues, and I'm still learning because things evolve and change, resources change, legislation changes. So it's important to stay up to date in order to be effective. So it's a big problem. Ohio in particularly, I think before the pandemic hit, Miami University did some studies, and it's predicted in the year 2040, more people are going to be turning age 85 than 18. So that tells me things that ignoring the problem isn't going to solve anything, because we're going to continue to face challenges. And the other big statistic that jumps out at me, when I first read that elder abuse victims are more likely to die, 300 times more likely to die than a non-victim, I thought it was a typo, because I'm like, it just seems such an outrageous number. But the fact is that people suffer, and there's serious consequences. People die faster. People are readily using emergency room services, nursing home services. So just by becoming a victim, you're more likely to have other issues and other complications. So it's important that we do something. So risk factors, we've been talking about risk factors, and I think especially now with the pandemic, we're very concerned about social isolation. Some of us are using the terms, staying safe in place, but for a predator, that's a prime opportunity to take advantage of an older adult, and they're taking advantage of fears associated with the pandemic. So it's actually, I'm concerned, and many of us that do this kind of work are very concerned, 6 months, a year down the road is when we're going to see the fallout of how older adults were affected by the pandemic. Because we already know that many of the people take advantage of them are the very same people that supposedly are helping them. I highlighted bereavement because that's another big reason that we forget. But when someone experiences a loss, so it could be a perfectly competent, intact older adult experiences a loss, during that time, and some of you have experienced your own losses, you kind of lose your sea legs. So it's very possible that while you're experiencing this big loss, you're not necessarily aware of everything, and you become very susceptible to exploitation. And we have bad guys, and I call them other things that I can't say right now because we're working. But the perpetrators will literally stalk and look at the newspapers looking for victims. So those are some of the reasons what makes someone a victim of elder abuse. But the problem is that, you know, recognizing them, because one of the things I talk about, and many of you have heard this, is that elder abuse is very underreported. And that's one of the reasons why it's very important we have these conversations, because we're most likely not to report it to a proper authority than to report it. We used to say 1 in 5 person was called in. Now we have some studies saying is 1 in 24. And then there was actually a study in New York City that was called Under the Radar that actually says, especially with exploitation, 1 in 43 cases get called in. So what that tells me is that we're only really dealing with the tip of the iceberg. So today I've been asked to talk a little bit about financial exploitation, but obviously there's different types of abuse. And in Ohio, when we use the word abuse, it encompasses physical, emotional, and psychological. When we talk about the neglect, it's usually associated to neglect by self or others. And we recently added abandonment to that definition. Financial exploitation many times encompasses all of those, because when someone's being exploited, how they're being controlled and manipulated, it's very commonly connected to one of the other allegations. So that's why it's important to recognize that. So in Ohio, the reason I exist in the Elder Justice Unit was created in 2014 by then Attorney DeWine, was because we had a very fragmented system. We don't have a one-stop shop. So any of you on the call, if you're experiencing issues around making reports, we get a lot of calls from individuals who have tried their own local resources and it didn't work. But typically, in a very large scale, Adult Protective Services typically has the authority to investigate cases when the individual, the adult, who has to be at least 60 years old, they have to have impairments, live in an independent living, a community dwelling. The long-term care ombudsman is responsible to be an advocate for long-term care. You guys use the word residents, so it could be older or younger, but most long-term residents are older. The Department of Health has oversight if the bad guy, the staff person, is actually a staff person. So the Ohio Department of Health regulates all long-term care, nursing homes, and assisted living. Not all group homes are licensed, and they kind of found a little gap. If it's not licensed, then it's probably not going to be investigated by the Department of Health. So that sometimes takes a little digging. My healthcare fraud section it's the only section in our office that has original jurisdiction to investigate cases of elder crimes that are committed in facilities, and we oftentimes forget that. So we're not talking about someone who doesn't like the type of food they're being provided or they're not provided activities, but crimes that are associated with lack of care, negligent care. So sometimes it's the agency, the nursing home is not providing the care, but they also can respond to cases of financial misappropriations of funds. They use the term misappropriations of fund, and that's part of the problem in Ohio. We don't have one set of definition. So it really takes someone who's familiar with all the different jargon and who uses what sometimes to bring people together, so we're even talking about the same thing. Law enforcement can obviously be called whether the person's in the facility or in the community, but typically law enforcement does better when the crime's occurring in the community, and they look towards my office and others to help them with investigations in facilities. So in terms of specifically looking at APS law, so sometimes we get frustrated because we'll call Adult Protective Services, and if it doesn't meet their criteria, they're going to screen it out. And that's important to know. That's why I shared with you the structure, because maybe instead of calling APS, you should be calling your ombudsman or the Department of Health. Ohio wrote the law. Our law is getting to be a little over 30 years old. We've had very little changes to the law. Lots of changes started in 2015. It was all attributed to the Ohio Elder Justice Act, because some of you are wondering, language from that budget was actually embedded twice in our law during the budget cycle. So the actual House bill never passed. It was the language that passed. But the intent of the APS law is that it provides it's not a criminal investigation. I was just on the phone yesterday with some folks with APS, and we were talking that I'm a fan of having APS and law enforcement working cases together because they do different things. Law enforcement typically is to enforce and protect the older, hold the older perpetrator accountable, where APS is focusing on services to protect the older adult. So they should be able to work together. It's limited in the ORC. So like we mentioned age, yes, in Ohio law it's 60. So we do not have, to this date, it's still a gap in law. We're one of 3 states that doesn't have a protective service law from 18 to 59. That causes a very big problem if your adult falls in that category. The Ohio law requires that the person have vulnerabilities. So some people use the word impairment, in the law it says vulnerabilities. So if you're if you're an adult that you might be 60, but you're able to provide your own protection, that case might be screened out, because the law says it's not just for the age, but looking at people who have a limitation or not able to care for themselves is why you have protective service laws. We also limit it to the community, which is a big problem, especially today, because back in 30 years ago, there was rest homes and we didn't have this back and forth. Nowadays, people move from the community to rehab centers, and they move to the placement, they come back home. So there's movement, but the law says that the person has to reside in the community. So again, it's restricted if they're living in a long-term care setting. The way our laws are written is to protect people's rights. So lots of folks don't like that, but a case can be validated, but if the older adult doesn't want help, we have to respect their autonomy, and they have the right to refuse. As a matter of fact, the APS law says they can refuse at any given moment. For APS to go forward in those cases, we have to have proof about capacity and some other concerns that would allow us to petition the court for protective service order. So this slide kind of just goes over what I just told you in terms of case acceptance, but I wanted you to share the Ohio Revised Code. It's actually in the definition of what is considered an adult. So let's talk a little bit about the money, because I hear this phrase all the time in my office. It's always about the money. You wanted to know more about exploitation and talk a little bit more. So the overall encompassing definition of exploitation is the improper use of somebody else's money, funds, or property. The problem with this definition is that it's too broad, and different systems have different definitions for what they consider exploitation. So in APS, and this is important, first of all, they don't use the term financial exploitation. It's exploitation because they also consider the exploitation of the person. And people get taken advantage all the time. Matter of fact, and what we're learning is that that's how the bad guys control them to get them to do things that they normally wouldn't do. So that's why it's actually just exploitation. And in Ohio in 2018, the big change for us is that we, for a long time, restricted the evildoer, another word I learned the other day, to the caretaker who was taking the funds, and that really restricted the cases being accepted, because what we've learned is that in many of these cases, the bad guy is known to the individual, but it's not necessarily the caretaker. It's not the person taking care of them. It's the person taking care of their money. So it's the fact that they're using their trust to exert that. The other part of the definition that I think is important to recognize, so not only is it a person that's misusing the funds, it's without using the person's consent, which a lot of our cases fall in the cracks, because that's one of the first things people ask, did the adult consent to it? And what we need to do, and what I'm talk a little bit about today, is we need to spend a little bit more time when an individual is consenting or appears to be consenting. One of the questions I ask a lot is, under what circumstances are they consenting? Because beyond the scope of consent is when someone, which is a common scenario, I give you my credit card to pay my bills, and because you have my credit card, now you use my credit card to buy yourself a new PlayStation or some clothes, cars, mint coat, but it appears that I gave it to you, but you've actually went beyond the consent of what I gave it to. So when we talk to people to find out what was their idea, what did they consent to, it's important, because we want to find out to what degree did they give it did they cooperate. The other thing we want to do is, in talking to them, is sometimes people consent because they've been lied to. I remember a case down in another county. The grandma gave her granddaughter $10,000 because they wanted to send one of the kids to school, and it turns out they used the money to buy a truck, not to send her to school. So that would be set by deception, because she gave the money with the intent that it would go for school, not to buy the truck. So and those are easy cases, and if you can prove the lie, but you're not going to find out until you have a conversation as to why did they give it to them. And then the more serious problems that I see more often are people who consent under distress. There's a threat or intimidation, and this could be happening right now under the COVID. If you don't give me this money, I'm going to place you in a nursing home. You know, so that'll motivate someone to give them to provide the money, but it's because they want to avoid the negative consequences in it, or to not see your grandchildren. I have a case the other day that it was a situation where if you don't give me the money, I'm not going to let you have a relationship with your grandchild. And of course that would motivate him. So it's really important to have those kind of conversations. The different things that we're looking for, well, usually, like I said, the older adults typically not going to tell you because they're afraid that we're going to take away their independence, or somehow we're not going to believe and we're going to think are crazy. So that's why it's important for us to learn and recognize some of the signs. Bills that aren't being paid, or utilities are being terminated. We're usually seeing things that's out of sort. When we investigate these cases, we do a lot of looking at patterns and patterns of behaviors. What was the pattern of the older adult? How did they spend their money, and how is it being spent now? Because what we're looking for are for signs as to if somebody came into their life and influenced them and how things are changing. We look for new wills and new power of attorneys. Any type of change in legal documents, a new best friend, where it usually dictates that something is out of the norm and something's not right, something might be going on. And not saying all new friends are bad guys, but it's important to look at when there's a new friend, what's changed and who's benefiting from that relationship. That's the other question we look at in terms of, like, the other day I had a individual who willed her house to the cable guy. So you have to ask yourself, is it normal for an individual to will their house, not will them, they were transferring it for free, to give it away for free? So under normal circumstances, no, that's not normal. That case was actually called into their Adult Protective Services by one of the new mandatory reporters. The auditor caught it. He just thought it was very strange that she was giving her house away for free for someone she had just met. And it led to an interesting investigation. She was actually a veteran, because I saw we had a couple of veteran staff from the VA on the call. Because of our advocacy and working with Adult Protective Services and the police in that particular case, we really pushed them to do a capacity evaluation, because there was some evidence to show that there was a decline in her mental decision making, but no one had formalized it in any particular way. But it was important to that case because on the surface it looked like she consented. She wanted to give this house to this person, and it looked, so we had to figure out and look at the case to find out how did that actually happen. So I mentioned this to you already, changing in documents that we look for, and if it doesn't look right, to ask those questions. So when you're calling APS, one of the handouts that we gave, first of all, APS, a new resource that's on the bottom there, they just recently, Adult Protective Services has a portal. So you can go online and you can make reports to Adult Protective Services online. I'm old school and I like phone calls. If you call this particular number, it'll route you back to your county, but this is important if you don't know where to call. APS in Ohio, we have a state supervised program, but it's county administered, meaning the state has very little oversight. The case is going to go right to the county that you're looking for, and the jurisdiction is usually based on where the person lives. It's a little tricky when people go in and out of hospitals, because I know when I was in Cuyahoga County, sometimes we had people from other counties, but typically it's based, APS follows the body, where typically the jurisdiction is based on where is that person. And it can get complicated. I mentioned this slide to you, and now you have it. So you see, I didn't make it up. 1 out of 43 cases, and that's that study was done in New York. New York is actually one of the only states that doesn't have mandatory reporting. There's some argument that doesn't think mandatory reporting is the solution. The solution is having moments like we're having right now, education, telling people what to look for and identifying it, and calling it because you're seeing what you're seeing and not based on your profession and you're mandated. So there's some interesting, we can talk about that too for a while, but we can't, we have to keep going. So in Ohio, the way our set up, we do have mandatory reporting, and I know a big reason that sometimes mandatory reporters don't call in is because they don't feel they have enough evidence, or they feel the person's competent and therefore they don't need to make the call. I'm going to tell you nicely that your job is just to have a reasonable cause to believe. So it's your job to identify the problem and have it called in. It's actually, if it's screened in, if the person doesn't want help, trust me, they have that right. Whether they have capacity or not should not impact whether you make the call. The capacity should be addressed whether or not they want help, whether once it's brought to their attention, whether they want help. And if you do make the call, because I get asked a lot of this, will I get sued? So if a mandatory reporter in Ohio makes the call to Adult Protective Services in good faith, you are immune from liability, and that's important. You can't get sued. And this is the list of who's been added. So we, at this point, have a very extensive mandatory list of reporters that include pharmacists, the mental health hospitals. The one that I'm seeing the most that's taking their responsibility are people that are working in the financial institutions. And in most counties, they're actually experiencing a lot of new cases because of the definition was expanded that I just went over, and the list was expanded. So most of our counties are really inundated with these cases. I think it's important to call in with as much information as you can. Because when you're calling in, the case can get screened out if, for instance, you don't know whether the person has an impairment. And I know they're not necessarily looking for a diagnosis. They want to know what you believe are situations that keep the person from protecting themselves. So if you suspect poor judgment, poor memory, making bad decisions, you want to focus on that. And if you don't know the answer, don't answer it. I know some counties that are small will screen out a case by asking you if you think the person's competent. So I'm going to give you a tip, and I know Lori's going to speak after me. All adults, we're all competent. It's assumed. Competency is assumed. So asking you that question, unless you know and have done an evaluation, or you know they've been in front of a judge and they've been adjudicated, you don't really want to answer that question. What you want to say is you have concerns about their capacity because they're making bad choices. Because one of the things you want to flag and screen are they seem to be making some poor choices. And I don't know if they're competent because this is what I'm seeing. This is the outcome. You want to focus on the problem and the risks when you're making those reports, because that's should be driving what I believe is the case acceptance. Because if you answer if they're competent, they might tell you they're adults and they have the right to make those decisions, and therefore the case won't get screened in. And if you're having trouble making a report, you're more than welcome to contact me and I can help you with that. This slide is just reminding us that anyone can be an exploiter. My screen froze up. Never mind, I got it to work. And they lie and they make excuses. And the big one here is that a lot of times they have a dependency on the victim. So I always, red flag people. The victim has money and has dependencies and vulnerabilities. Bad guy has no money and then therefore becomes dependent on the older adult. And they use a lot of ways to lie to them and make false promises that they're going to take care of them. But I know several older adults who gave their house to someone and opened up their doors because they needed help. And later, once the house was transferred, next thing you know, they were losing their home. So they do use all types of ways of manipulating the individual. When you interview them, you want to be careful, because I know I saw on the call we have several people that work with caregivers. I tease sometimes that you call them caregivers. I call them perpetrators, because they might be very nice to you because they're wanting you to like them and trust them. Usually they target the one individual would be their victim, and they tend to make excuses. But in the old days when APS was young and we were looking at research, we used to think, and did a lot of research around what motivated the bad guy, we used to think it was stress. If caregiver stress led to abuse. What we've learned is that isn't true. It can be true. There's a connection there, but it's really the contents of the content of the relationship and my perception of the care. It's a little bit more complicated than just a direct. I know I have some researchers on the call. It's not an automatic. Many people provide a lot of good care, and they don't abuse their victim. It's really based on control and greed. So when we're working with our older adults, as I mentioned, they can be challenging because they want us to stop the abuse, but they don't necessarily want us to hold the bad guy accountable. I focus on what their needs are, not so much what might happen to the the perpetrator, because what happens to the perpetrator, I can't control that, because if they committed a crime, well, that might lead to. So it's really based on their actions. It's not on what the older person wants. But this is one of the reasons why people may recant their statements, because they're going to work with you, but then they're threatened, or somebody gets in their ear about making new promises that they're going to take care of them. So older adults can't, sometimes they don't cooperate. So when we work these cases, we have to look at it almost as if we have an unwilling victim. When this particular slide talks about the consent as defense, because I spent a lot of time talking to APS and law enforcement, as I mentioned, about under what circumstances does the person agree. We look at their ability, and has anyone evaluated their decisional capacity. We also talk about undue influence, and undue influence can happen with a competent person. It doesn't have to be someone who's not impaired, but it's basically when someone cultivates a relationship and gets the person to do what they want. But consent drives not just APS, but criminal cases. And this is why it's so important when someone's being victimized and there's a risk to that not taking action, is to really look at the issue of their ability to consent. Do they have that ability in order to build a case without their cooperation? These are some of the questions that I've used, and I have more of them, but I typically don't just ask a person a straight question. I want to ask them questions to let me figure out what's going on and to see what their perception is of what's going on without being very direct, because if I ask a direct question, I'm probably not going to get the answer I want. So, did someone push you into this? Did you have a chance to review it with anyone? Because I want to see if they had a chance to act freely and willingly, as opposed to someone, like if someone gets a power of attorney, whose idea was it? Whose attorney? Who brought you to that attorney? Because what I'm trying to find out, if this person picked that attorney on their own, or were they influenced in some way? So along those lines, in terms of getting detection in your jobs, I would encourage all of you to have some more questions in terms of, if you're seeing a problem, how are you screening those questions, and are you doing them on a regular basis? Because I'm already telling you it's underreported. You might be the only person that could be seeing the possibility of someone being exploited, and if you don't have any screening questions in your assessment packets, that could be an opportunity loss. So some of the questions around money, I know older adults don't like talking about it, but really spending a little bit of time about asking them about, who manages your money? Is there a new person managing their money? These are some questions that can help you screen to see if there's a problem and help you determine if you need to make a report to one of the authorities. When we're talking about these cases, many of them have not been evaluated. I saw that Dr. Droz is on the call. I've had her speak with me on other presentations, because one of the things, I'm not saying every older adult that's being victimized should have an evaluation, but I think that I would lean towards having them looked at if we see that there's a high risk and great harm will come if we don't. There's a certain point where we need to stop assuming that they have capacity. It doesn't, protecting that right to self-determination doesn't, sometimes can avoid and keep us from providing the kind of care we should be doing. So in terms of reminders, I don't want you just listening and interviewing with the exploiter. I want you to not just take their word for it. Try to interview them separately. Sometimes it's good to take two people with you, because one can interview the adult while the other one interviews the older adults, and you can kind of compare notes. Documents are important. I always ask people to get copies of the documents. Don't just assume. If somebody says they have power of attorney, get a copy of it. When was it executed? What does it say? Because not all power of attorneys are written the same. And they usually don't go in effect unless there's some type of proof that the person's incapacitated. I've actually used that reason multiple times to get someone evaluated, because I want to prove it if you have capacity. And of course, I'd rather have you contact APS and law enforcement whenever you can. And if you need assistance with that, I do a lot of work. The Elder Justice Unit does a lot of work connecting people to the resources at hand. And sometimes I act as a mediator, because there's Sometimes people, if you're too close to the problem, sometimes you're not objective. So sometimes someone like me can help see it from afar, and different things can happen. I believe very much in the collaborative approach. I know that some of you work, this group is collaborative. I know that most counties have an I-team. These cases that can't be solved, sometimes it's helpful to bring them to an I-team to hear the different perspectives and share. I know in Cuyahoga County, and it still has an I-team. I helped start it back then. A lot of cases that are stuck get resolved because we're bringing the resources together and talking about them. So I went a little bit over, but the introductions did go over a little bit. So in fairness to me, I tried really hard to stay on time. I want everyone to have, that number is to our help center, and then that's our, so you can actually file a report if it's a scam as opposed to an exploitation. But those are our resources, and the ohioprotects.org is a great website because it just has the information about scams. Where the Ohio Attorney General.gov is a very context-rich website. And there's me. I am working remotely right now. I get calls, emails all the time, folks looking for direction. And at this point in my career, I consider myself a navigator. I'm able to direct cases and what systems would be best appropriate, what's missing, what do we want to try. So I want to make sure you have my resource. I gave a lot of resources to the group because obviously I can't cover everything in this short amount of time, but hopefully I've answered some questions and give you some guidance, and then you know what, that I'm available for a resource, and if I didn't. So thank you.
Well, thank you, Sylvia. I have an amazing amount of new information, okay. And as I'm sure everyone, as does everyone else who I think was on this call. Does anyone, I'd like to open it up for questions because I think that your information may have very well, you can unmute to ask a question at this point, or if you'd like to put a question in the chat box, that would be fine.